Payne, then come back to you, Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr President, and in participating in this afternoon's debate, I also offer my personal condolences to the Whitlam family following the passing of Edward Gough Whitlam, AC QC, Australia's 21st Prime Minister. Mr Whitlam was, by no short measure, an indefatigable social reformer. But for my purposes this afternoon, I wanted to particularly speak about the enormous contribution that he made to the city of which I am so proud, the city of Sydney, and most particularly Western Sydney. He convincingly won the federal seat of Werriwa in 1952 and moved to Cabramatta in Western Sydney in 1955 following an electoral redistribution. Cabramatta of 2014 and the Cabramatta of 1955 are almost unrecognisable, but as the same place. But there are vestiges of that very traditional Sydney environment still remaining, Mr President. In doing so, the Whitlam family experienced the lack of infrastructure, the lack of amenities at first hand, whilst he and Margaret tried to raise a family of 4 children in that part of Western Sydney. And that gave him a strong resolve to do everything he could to improve the lives of those living in the new residential areas on city fringes. Whilst Mr Whitlam's reformist zeal is most recognised, probably in the areas of education and health and the rights of Indigenous Australians, his commitment to empowering regions like Western Sydney was an overarching objective. In his 1972 campaign speech, which others have spoken about today and quoted, Mr Whitlam said that cities were fundamental to the mission of his government and that, and I quote, "a national government which cuts itself off from the nation's cities is cutting itself off from the nation's real life," unquote. It was his government that was the first Commonwealth government to provide significant funding for urban public transport projects. In 1973, the Whitlam government announced the Urban Public Transport Assistance Scheme to provide states with matching funds for public transport improvement projects, including new trains and buses and ferries. That scheme also extended and electrified railways, and for Sydney and for Western Sydney, it opened up extraordinary new opportunities for our residents by providing faster and easier links to the Sydney CBD and other business centres throughout the region. Mr Whitlam recognised that improved access to GP services, to tertiary education and the resulting employment opportunities would only be beneficial if residents in the expanding outer suburbs had the transport they needed to get them to their doctors or to their university lectures. And another important contribution, Mr President, by Mr Whitlam that Senator Wong mentioned and that others have also referred to was his government's major investment in developing a sewerage scheme in Western Sydney, whose rapid expansion in the 1950s and 1960s was not accompanied by basic services. Their government implemented the National Sewerage Program soon after it was elected in 1972, investing $330 million in urban sanitation projects, an extraordinary amount of money in those days. They also initiated the Area Improvement Program, which funded state and local governments to make Western Sydney and particularly suburban Melbourne more livable, and that included parks and bridges and libraries and community centres. And I think you can see by the architecture of many of the libraries that you see around our suburbs in Sydney and Melbourne that they most definitely date from that Area Improvement Program. In addition to his government's introduction of Medibank, the precursor to Medicare, which provided access to medical care for people who couldn't afford private insurance, and I would note at this point, Mr President, that that initiative of the Whitlam government means a great deal to many staff of long standing in my own Department of Human Services who were part of the original Medibank and Medicare. He also oversaw a major investment in public hospitals in Western Sydney. The Whitlam government invested more than $140 million in those days in new hospitals, including a seeding grant for the construction of Westmeads Hospital, the region's first major teaching hospital and the centre of a precinct that has grown to become a world-class research hub. His experiences also taught him that education was the key to opportunity and social mobility for people living in the western suburbs of Sydney. And he worked very hard to close the funding gap between government and non-government schools, particularly given so many children in Western Sydney were attending those schools. At the tertiary level, his government abolished tuition fees for students at universities and technical colleges. That, of course, led to flow-on policy effects in later Labor governments, but it opened up opportunities at the time for students in Western Sydney and provided means-tested financial assistance for students. In 1974, they established the Commonwealth's full responsibility for university funding throughout Australia. He strongly advocated the establishment of a university in Western Sydney, and although he didn't achieve it during his time in office, there's nobody who could deny that his tireless advocacy contributed to the establishment of the University of Western Sydney in 1989. In 2000, he joined with the University of Western Sydney to establish the well-regarded Whitlam Institute. The Institute really has excelled in the study of the history and future development of the Greater Western Sydney region and to teaching and scholarship on urban regions throughout the country. It's a vital resource in Western Sydney as we strive to develop the road, the rail, the air infrastructure and the knowledge jobs in the new Western Sydney employment area as part of our quest to help the region fulfil its great potential. I must say, Mr President, I'm very proud to be part of the Liberal government that is doing that for Western Sydney and in Western Sydney now. Mr Whitlam has made an important contribution to the process of the growth of the Whitlam Institute when he provided access to his records and papers from his private collection to form the Whitlam Prime Ministerial Collection at UWS Parramatta. These documents, which span his leadership in the areas of health and social welfare, urban and regional planning and development and education and Indigenous affairs, helped to provide a blueprint, if you like, for what is now happening in Western Sydney in the 21st century. Mr President, my father and Edward Gough Whitlam were born in the same year. They both served in the Second World War. My father in the Army and, of course, Mr Whitlam in the Air Force. They were, however, men of very different views. And the passing of Mr Whitlam passing of Mr Whitlam's government the passing of Mr Whitlam has made me contemplate in the last week or so when I did realise that my father and Mr Whitlam were the same age, made me think about what had happened in my family in 1975 and whether perhaps that was the energising process, if you like, for my own personal engagement and involvement in politics, because I know that the events of 1975 were much discussed in my home, around the table, amongst my family. My father was a conservative man and had some very strong views. In fact, I remember when I was first at university, I had a very serious car accident which resulted in a third-party personal injury claim that had to be litigated ultimately. And my father had chosen with our solicitor a barrister who was on 10th floor Wentworth Chambers. And he took me to see this particular barrister, now Peter McEwen SC, the head of Martin Place Chambers these days. And when we went into his chambers with the solicitor and sat down and the door was shut, we saw that on the back of Peter McEwen's door was Edward Gough Whitlam's, E.G. Whitlam's old nameplate from having previously been in Wentworth Chambers himself. For a split second, I really thought my father was going to get up and walk out and say that we were not going to consult with the barrister on that matter. But it struck me that Mr Whitlam's contribution to the legal profession as well, in fact the entire Whitlam family's contribution to the legal profession in Sydney was very important. In 1975, I was a student at Earlwood Public School in inner South Sydney, I suppose you would describe it as. The year before, in 1974, I had as my teacher Mr Laurie Daly, who was the son of famous and famed Whitlam Cabinet Minister Fred Daly. In 1974, Laurie Daly indicated that he'd given up on me because I had chosen Leilani as my horse in the Melbourne Cup because it was owned by Andrew Peacock. He thought I was a lost cause then. But when 1975 came, when you had Fred Daly's son teaching along the same veranda as you on the day of the dismissal, it most certainly, I think, provided to the students of Earlwood Public School in grades 5 and 6 a very close-up experience of what that event meant to the adults in the room, but most particularly to people of that era who were actively involved in the Labor Party. It was an insight totally serendipitous that I believe very few would have had. On issues like media diversity and Australia becoming a republic, I watched Mr Whitlam and Mr Fraser engage together, and as some have said earlier today, to see those two giants, both literal and figuratively, of Australian politics able to do that was, to me, a remarkable study in human nature. To see them, I think the event was held at the Sydney Opera House on media diversity, to see them standing together on the stage, united in that cause. I was a younger woman then, but very interested in the concepts, and I thought they were very important to Australia. And I remember sitting in that audience marvelling at them being together. As a strong Republican, I mentioned in the few words I spoke in relation to Mrs Whitlam's passing that she and Mr Whitlam and I had spent quite some time together. But my best and my most recent memory, Mr President, which I would like to refer to very briefly, was the Australian Law Reform Commission 25th anniversary dinner held in 2000, in the year 2000 in Sydney. The Australian Law Reform Commission was established by Mr Whitlam in 1975. The dinner I was privileged to share the table that evening with Mr and Mrs Whitlam and with Michael Black, ACQC, then Chief Judge of the Federal Court. I had never been in such close proximity to a former Prime Minister at that stage, and I was fascinated by the erudition of his conversation, by his natural charm, and he was, of course, as one might expect, voluble. And I watched with amusement as Mrs Whitlam gently chided him across the table, indicating that perhaps the Chief Justice might like to contribute to the conversation, or even Senator Payne. And he took the admonition poorly and indicated that he thought they would much prefer to listen to him. He was probably right. I want to extend my sympathies, Mr President, to his extended family, particularly his children, to Tony, Stephen, Nicholas and Catherine, and his grandchildren, and Mr President, also to Miss Freda Whitlam, who has long been in Western Sydney and I have seen from time to time around Penrith over a number of years. Australia has lost a leader, an intellect, an extraordinary wit, not often seen in today's parliament. Perhaps the days of Killen and Whitlam and Daly will go down in Australian political history, not to mention Menzies, of course. So Australia has lost a leader, but the Whitlam family has also lost their leader. And our thoughts are with them all, Mr President, and I'm proud to have had the opportunity to make a small contribution in this debate.